Okay, all, it's January 4th, 2021, and it's certainly time for a crucial viral update. Just the data, the facts, and the science, nothing else. And we're going to start with kind of zoning ourselves in. So here's Sweden with no lockdown and no masks in the COVID epidemic. And we can see the Spanish flu here had a very high spike of deaths per million in the peak of the epidemic. We see also that many flus in the past few decades in Sweden had a peak mortality that was much lower than Spanish flu, but we see them here. And here's COVID-19 in Sweden with no lockdowns and no masks and basic WHO distancing. Okay, so you can see that it's on the order of many flu epidemics in the past few decades, and it's way lower than Spanish flu 1918. So we'll break out that data into a simpler view, and we'll focus on something vastly more important even than death rates per million, and that's the life years lost over baseline level in the peak of an epidemic. And we'll drop out these ones, and we'll show that there's a study in 2018 which very usefully shows us the age distribution of deaths in the Spanish flu epidemic. And you can see they're overwhelmingly below 60 years of age, right? And 20 to 30 is around the median age. So the median age of death being around there might mean 45 quality years of life lost per death, okay? And for people who want to argue, remember there were infant deaths too, and there were mothers and fathers with families. Deaths were extremely common, right? So around 45 quality life years lost per death. COVID-19, and probably being generous here, 1 quality year, maybe. Professor Levitt indicated less than 6 months on average of quality years of life lost, right? But it could be 1. And if we correct for this here impact on life and quality of life becomes like this. So it's clearly hundreds of times lower than the Spanish flu impact on humanity. So anyone who compares in any way, shape or form COVID-19, even in no lockdown, no mask Sweden, to the Spanish flu is lying to you on an epic scale. So let's keep that in mind, and we'll move on to the efficacy of lockdowns to impact this problem. So to remind you, the World Health Organization October 2019 pandemic guidelines clearly stated that quarantine of exposed individuals to reduce transmission is not recommended, clearly. And you can see on a recent blog post I did, there's around 25 published analyses now which clearly show that lockdown has very limited or no efficacy in affecting mortality per million across all the countries. And we can just look at some examples. This was out many months ago from Pandata, and you can see the stringency of lockdown versus the deaths per million in the 51 countries here. There's essentially no relationship. Shotgun scatter plot, no relationship. The Lancet had a big one, and that came from Chowdhury. And rapid border closures, full lockdowns, widespread testing were not associated with COVID-19 mortality per million people. Okay, so that's Lancet. Why? So why are there 25 studies showing that lockdown has very little or no efficacy in impacting deaths per million? Why are we where we are now? Well, a lot of it is to do with this man. Many others are culpable, but Professor Neil Ferguson owns a large share of the blame. Incredibly, in the Times recently, 26 December 2020, he acknowledged that Sage and the rest of the team and himself were looking at China and seeing all their lockdown. But they said, it's a communist one-party state. We couldn't get away with it in Europe, we thought. And then Italy did it, and we realized we could do this. So we realized we could turn Europe into China. And that's what started the whole thing. Now we'll look at lockdown from a different perspective. Here's all of Europe, deaths per million. You can see here the epidemic, And you can see here the seasonal resurgence this winter. Now remember, in Europe, the actual death rate is much, much lower now, but these are deaths badged with SARS-CoV-2 from a PCR, so it looks particularly bad. But we'll show you the actual mortality shortly. So we look at this in Europe versus all of these Asian countries, and we look at this difference, 50 times lower, right? These are around 2% of Europe in terms of deaths per million. And we see it in the seasonal resurgence as well, enormously lower in these countries. Now, anyone who thinks at this point that lockdowns or masks, given the literature, the scientific literature, that allows them maybe a slight effect, could be a 98% reduction, is either evil or has a bias and a conflict of interest in this thing, or is a cognitive bias of some other sort, or has been propagandized, or is just plain stupid. Or perhaps you could be a mixture of all four. That's a possibility too. Let's focus a little more on Japan, because there's a lot to learn there. So Japan appeared to beat the coronavirus, almost no mortality, even in their so-called second wave. And again, we take an example, Sweden with no lockdown, but England with a lockdown is much worse. But either way, we see a European country. Look at the 98% or 99% lower mortality in Japan. Right? And to our earlier point, no way that can be due to lockdown. And if you believe that that was related to lockdown and masks, well, we went through that already, right? But here's some of the reasons why Japan is vastly lower than the other Asian countries. One example is metabolic health of the elderly. And to give an example, Italy is the vitamin D black spot of Europe, not just catastrophically low vitamin D in the elderly, but also vitamin D is a reflection of metabolic health. So you've got that as well, that you know their metabolic health is in the toilet. Japan, in contrast, has a strikingly low incidence of vitamin D deficiency versus Europe. Prevalence of vitamin D lower than 30. In active elderly, in one study, was below 5%. So 95% were above 30. 3/4 or more are below 12 or even below 5 in Italy. Now that's a massive difference in metabolic health. Another huge factor, and I'm going to show you a study from Tokyo. Now, Tokyo had no lockdowns. They had mask use, but not 100% by any means. We've got the photos. And here they took a few hundred people, and this study should have been done all over the world, but it was not. They took a few hundred people in 13 sites across Tokyo during the surge in PCR positives when they had their kind of epidemic. And what they saw by antibody testing them every 2 weeks was an amazing thing. They saw that nearly 50% developed antibodies to SARS-CoV-2. And then the antibodies faded, which is natural, but they'll be ready next time because the T-cell memory will be there. But essentially, it spread like wildfire in Tokyo. But the difference was, as I showed you in the preceding slide, they didn't really get impacted because they had prior immunity from previous SARS is one reason. And they also have the high metabolic health relative to Europe, which is another big reason. And there are other reasons. But just on the prior immunity, many publications now on T-cell immunity. SARS-1 actually, in one study, 17 years later, people who were exposed still had the T-cell memory. And it's in the BMJ here, and you can read this, a good review paper. But this is established at this stage. Prior immunity to varying degrees in different populations. Now, no lockdown Sweden. This is a very important control country. So for all the media attacks on Sweden and bizarre lies and propaganda, Sweden had no lockdown and no masks. So here the schools up to 16 years old kept running as normal, and I'm informed no one was taking much notice. The cafes, 1 meter distance, basically followed the WHO 2019 guidelines, but otherwise all open for business. People moving around, living their lives, and this is May the 6th in the epidemic. And even elderly ladies videoed by CNN, May the 6th, in the epidemic, no masks, getting their hair cut. And the reality of all of this is, in 2020, you see Sweden in the blue here, deaths normalised, and they're no different than their neighbours. Okay? They had a soft 2019 mortality, and they may have been compensating. But in the end of 2020, when all the figures are in, they'll be a little higher, but the soft 2019 will account for why they were higher in 2020 compared to their neighbours. Here's another view. Sweden in the blue, certainly during their epidemic, increased their mortality. Right? You can see the inflection here in the curve. But Scotland was far worse with ultra hard lockdowns. Okay? And you can see the overall mortality rates are the same as their neighbours. And even with the increase, partially due to a soft 2019, they are still in the same ballpark as their neighbours. So all of that stuff you heard about the Nordics was all pretty much propaganda, and I hope you didn't fall for it. Just show you the 2019 soft season and early 20 very soft season up to March. Sweden were running a trailing low mortality with a lot of elderly, frail and susceptible built up. So they did a great job in not having elderly mortality here, but it hit them harder than their neighbours then. UK is very similar. You can see the trough here, and then they got hit really hard because the UK has terrible metabolic health. Just to compare with the Nordics, Finland and Norway here, you see a completely different picture. They were steady in mortality all the way. So that's the big explanation for Sweden, not lockdown or masks. And there are papers out on this showing Sweden's big build-up of frail, susceptible elderly in the prior years, and then commensurate with that, getting sadly pretty big hit compared to their neighbours. Now let's look overall Europe, Euromomo, the master database, and we look at 65 plus years. So here you can see in 2018 you've got excess mortality in the winter, 2019 soft in Europe, not so much excess, and then COVID pretty hard hit in March, April 2020. And here we have most of the remainder of 2020. So pretty nasty seasonal resurgence, but I'm going to explain that now in more detail. We must compare seasons. This is crucial. You cannot compare a month from here or a month from there with some other month back here, unless it's just to show that they're similar, but you can't compare otherwise. So here's the seasons. 2017 into 18, 120,000 approx extra mortality in 65 plus, and around 140,000 in total, including the younger ages. 60,000 approx in 18-19, soft season, around 70,000 in total. Now we have the very soft early 2020 season up to March, right? And that adds to this to build up frail, susceptible. And then we have around 170,000 in the actual COVID spike. So including all ages, around 185,000. So you'll see it's not hugely different than 18 at all. And let's look at this seasonal resurgence, which we called out back in the summer would happen. We don't know yet what the area under the curve will be, but it's looking like it may be similar to 2017-18 in total excess mortality, or it may be higher and more like 170 or 180. We don't know yet, but again, not out of the ballpark of 18. Now let's turn to America and take a look at a high level and explain some of the core. So here is Florida, and you can see the deaths per million, around 8 per million at the peak back here in around July. And the governor, based on the input from Professor Michael Levitt of Stanford and professors from Harvard, made a decision to drop all restrictions in restaurants, etc., banned mask fines, dropped masks. So what happened, the mortality per million or per 100,000 in Florida after this was done? Right. As expected and predicted, it had no impact on the mortality curves. And that's dropping the restrictions and the masks. The rest of America actually went on to do worse than Florida on average. Here's California, which is a good comparison to Florida. They had insane amounts of lockdown activity, and they're escalating their lockdown stuff, masks everywhere, all that stuff compared to Florida. And they're doing worse on mortality per million. And this just about clinches it, though we have hundreds of comparisons showing the exact same logic, right? That lockdowns and masks don't move the needle. We look at South Dakota. It was brought up by a friend of mine there. South Dakota seasonally triggered, right? Got a very high peak and fell down sharply. Okay, they had not been affected earlier, but they seasonally, regionally triggered. And North Dakota, similarly, because they're beside each other and they have similar population density. And the area under the curve for mortality is very similar within the noise, and they both fell off sharply together. But interestingly, North Dakota rolled over, brought in a mask mandate, hard mask mandate, and it would have started impacting mortality here, where the black dotted line is. Ironically, if anything, their mortality went the other way. And in any case, South Dakota, with freedom and no mask mandate, came down in lockstep pretty much with North Dakota. So here's a perfect natural experiment that closes the case. But we have many, many more examples all across the countries and the states. Again and again, the empirical proof is there. These things don't move the mortality needle. One would wonder why they're still doing them. Here's a picture sent to me on Twitter yesterday from South Dakota, and this would be typical, apparently. And Florida, we'll just return to briefly. Certainly during their real epidemic phase, they had excess mortality or increased mortality rates over prior years. But notice since the governor got rid of the lockdowns and masks, even though they're showing on our curves some excess mortality, in real world, all-cause mortality, nothing showing up. So that's important too. The deaths with COVID that you see every day are people badged with a positive PCR who died. Within 28 days of death, they got a positive PCR. That is not the same as actually having extra deaths in your country or region. Just looking here at regions, the power of seasonality, regionality, here's upper Midwest, pick a few states, you see they all behave the same, independent of lockdown or mask measures. And you can grab coastal southeast here and they all behave the same, independent of mask mandates or lockdowns, because the virus gonna virus based on seasonal, regional patterns. Yes, there's spread involved, but you can't really impact that, sadly. You should be improving your population metabolic health. You should be using the many, many treatments that could help that are not being used over the past 8 or 9 months. And you should be basically upping your capacity for hospitals, training new staff for any potential problem. That all makes sense. But the lockdowns and masks make no engineering, technical, societal, any sense because of the huge damage they do. Another quick view, if you look all across these different areas, they're all going up together regardless of the measures taken, right? So Sweden is actually less bad than many. But again, it has to be stressed that these are deaths within 28 days of a positive PCR. They are not the actual death rates or increased deaths. You see them from the databases are much lower than this. But they're all the same pretty much heading into the winter. Now, detailed view across Europe. This is again Euromomo per country. They're Z-scores, but they give you an overall indication of the impact of excess mortality. So I've split them into different groups. This group is 4 of the 25 countries. I call it harder hit countries seasonally split wave. And the reason is that the season in the summer, coronavirus pretty much disappears. No ICU, no deaths all summer. We saw that all over Europe again and again. But these countries, they got a wave, but the season kind of clipped it short before they got full community immunity, if you will. So there was a price to pay in elderly and frail in the winter resurgence, which we predicted from way back in the summer. So here it is. Belgium, France, Switzerland, and Italy are pretty much under this category. And Switzerland, okay, kind of nearly missed their first wave, and they're getting hit now. The next grouping I do is harder hit countries, seasonally delayed wave. And that's 2 of the 25 countries we'll be showing you. And they basically seasonally missed the first triggering of SARS-CoV-2. So they're getting it all now. So that's an example of those countries. Third group are harder hit countries, but no real winter 2020 wave. And there's 5 of these countries of the 25. UK is one of those. You can see the hit here, but really barely above the line for the winter 2020. UK, Scotland, similar. Sweden, certainly similar. And again, you would have seen in Sweden that deaths are high, but the reality is that's a lot of badging. Real all-cause mortality or mortality rate is not too unusual. Spain, okay, they are getting a certain amount of excess mortality here, but nothing like the first wave. And Ireland running really low mortality for the last couple of months. So Ireland will have a normal or even better than normal mortality year this year overall. Now, the fourth and largest group of countries, 14 out of the 25. And here I'm saying no real epidemic countries. And the reason is that, yes, SARS-CoV-2 is all over the place, but they never sustained major mortality at all. And the 2009 definition of an epidemic included major mortality and impact, not from lockdowns, but major impact from the virus. So in other words, you'd know people who knew people who had it, who died. It would be clear as day to your own eyes. That was the old definition of epidemic. And in 2009, the WHO, working with industry leaders in pharmaceutical and others and government people, dropped the severity part of the definition of epidemic and made it just that a virus is all over the place. So that changed the definition a lot. But I would go back to the definition of an epidemic where you get major impact on mortality, etc. So 14 of the 25 countries look like this. There really isn't a whole lot going on above baseline, right? Take Germany here. They had bigger humps back in 17 and 18 than they have had in the whole of 2020, right? So here's 5 countries out of this very important group. Here's another 5, Estonia, Luxembourg, Greece, Finland. Greece has a bit of action here now, in fairness. But again, they had the same back in 17. So we didn't call an epidemic then. So you get the point. Here's another 5, Israel, Norway, Denmark, Hungary, Malta. Again, nothing notable. If you jumble these 14 countries up, their mortality curves, mixed up the years, no one would pick out an epidemic. Denmark had more going on in 18 than they have all this year, right? So you get the point. Europe summary overall then. Harder hit countries seasonally split wave. There's 4 of them. Belgium shown here. Harder hit countries seasonally delayed wave. 2 of them. Harder hit countries no real winter 2020 wave at all really. 5. And no real epidemic by the old definition countries, 14 out of 25. That's the picture of mortality across Europe for the whole of 2020. And latest paper out from the Karolinska Institute, from John O. Lundberg, professor, hugely published. And they basically say that the mortality due to COVID-19 in a given country in Europe could have been largely predicted even before the pandemic hit, simply by looking at longitudinal variability of all-cause mortality rates in the years preceding the current outbreak. In other words, if you look at the behaviour of mortality, the build-up of frail, lower than expected mortality I showed you for Sweden, just looking at that factor alone could have let you largely predict most of the impact per country in Europe. So that'll tell you something huge. Now I'm going to show you something important. My September 8 crucial update that got 1.7 million views. Towards the end of it, I clearly called out that there would be a winter resurgence in Europe. And just to show you, some people have said that I didn't indicate that, which is clearly untrue. This is a screenshot. I suggested the Spain mortality curve for late 20 into 21, the winter, might look something like this. Okay, and I made the point that it's probably going to be worse because of the measures that were taken to suppress community immunity. But anyway, the Euromomo real-life Spain mortality curve, we touched on it a moment ago, this is it here up until end of December. So actually, I predicted a higher mortality than occurred, not a lower one. So there you are. So that's important for the record. We've been accurate. The people like myself and the groups we're in trying to counter the lockdown madness that's ruining society, we've been accurate on 90% of what we've been predicting and explaining. Sadly, the so-called experts have been around 90% wrong on seasonality, dormancy, impact, modelling, pretty much everything. So there you go. Ireland special focus for the end of the video and the lockdown madness that's going on here at the moment. So Ireland, as we showed you, will have an ordinary mortality year, a bump here for sure back in April, but the average age or median age around 84 years and really low for the last couple of months. But things have hotted up in the winter for sure, so I'll show you that. Just to note, where is the flu gone? This is a really important point. So we were up the walls with 500-600 trolleys in emergency rooms for many, many years now because of the under-resourced healthcare system and because of flus. And you can see the articles. But there's no flu in 2020 whatsoever, anywhere, right? So basically SARS-CoV-2 has taken over. So we want to look now and see, is 2020 winter really that much different than prior winters? And to understand why the flu has gone, I'd suggest this book, Transmission of Epidemic Influenza by Dr. Edgar Hope Simpson. And there's a link there where you can download it. And he answers many of the questions that no one else seems to answer. But key is that he talks about the vanishing trick in virology, where influenza strains that have been around for a long time, when a new one comes in, they literally disappear, never to be seen again. Only maintained in the laboratory, but not in hosts. So this is a common thing, and there are multiple papers on it. So that's one reason. It's viral interaction or competition, that when a dominant strain or a dominant virus takes over, other ones can simply drop off the map. And just to show you how this can happen, Sweden with no lockdown and no masks, so no excuses about masks or lockdown having lowered the flu. So in Sweden, you'll see, here's 1920, and around February going into March, this period, the influenza just drops off the map, okay, influenza A, and it's flat line. And then for the rest of 2020, the red line up till now, no influenza, okay. And they didn't do any lockdown or any masks. I showed you, right, with your own eyes, okay, but the influenza disappeared regardless. So it's not lockdowns or masks getting rid of influenza. Influenza B, similarly, same picture. SARS-CoV-2 triggered seasonally, regionally. Once it triggered, influenza disappeared. Coronaviruses, the other ones, they all pretty much fell off the map too. You can see here when COVID-2 triggered, they disappeared. And the red line is for the rest of this year up until now. Pretty much gone. However, rhinoviruses went ahead as normal. So they fell somewhat when SARS-CoV-2 triggered, but they're really behaving relatively normal during the summer when SARS-CoV-2 activity was low. So it's not the lockdowns and masks. The rhinovirus is a different family. Influenza and coronaviruses are very similar family, and they have the exact same period of triggering seasonally. But rhinoviruses are more a summer virus, different, and they appear not to be affected by SARS-CoV-2 nearly as much. But again, the key point is it's not the lockdowns and the masks, because in Sweden the flu disappeared as well, and any other countries with very little lockdown or masks. We'll just show you briefly the USA, flu fell off the map as well, right, when COVID-2 came in. This is England, and similar story. Rhinoviruses are performing away right up until the last couple of weeks. SARS-CoV-2 has the winter resurgence here, and the influenzas have all dropped off the map. So all the countries, regardless of measures, rhinovirus powers ahead, but the influenzas and other coronaviruses pretty much get out of the way. Now, back to Ireland. We've got 2018 here, and you'll see that from around September, the blue bars are the hospital beds. They head up to around 550 hospital beds with respiratory, and driven by viral issues in the most part. But here's mapping SARS-CoV-2 hospital beds in the same period, and it's not hugely dissimilar in terms of hospital beds. So even though we have a hyper focus on testing, and you'd expect to see more beds attributed because we're testing so hard, it's actually not too dissimilar. But certainly in very late December, early January, there's a lot of virus activity for SARS-CoV-2, as we predicted, and I guess it had to happen sometime. But the impacts on severe symptoms or mortality, that's what we need to track in the coming weeks. So looking a little closer at the actual metrics for Ireland, this is right up to the 3rd or 4th of January. We have the positivity rate here, and it curled over in mid-October of PCR tests for SARS-CoV-2. Cases in hospital, but remember that a lot of these people will be people who are in hospital for another reason, but they've got a positive PCR, so it's not necessarily driven by COVID, and ICU similarly. So let's look. On 17th of October, the positivity rate curled over clearly and came down. So some kind of dynamic going on here, seasonally, regionally, temperature, humidity, we don't know. The virome is complex, but it turned around there. Yet the level 5 lockdown, full lockdown, was brought in and would have affected the curve at this point, or even later. No effect whatsoever of the level 5 lockdown on the trajectory of the curve for positivity in the PCR testing. 21st of October, the hospital beds attributed to SARS-CoV-2 clearly curled over, and the lockdown level 5 might have acted around here on the curve. Again, no impact mathematically. The level 5 lockdown did nothing. And ICU is kind of flat anyway, and you can't tell much from that. Level 5 went back to level 3 at this point here, and for around 12 or 13 days nothing happened. But if level 5 was working and we opened up completely, you'd expect within a few days to start seeing something going on, but we didn't. But then we'll look from mid-December on, and clearly something's happening here. So SARS-CoV-2 could be seasonally triggering. It certainly appears that it shot up, but also the test kind of regime or who you're testing could affect this. But it's a very sudden increase. You'd expect the hospitalizations to follow a little later than this sudden population increase in infected people. You'd expect the hospitalizations to lag. But interestingly, they don't. They match it almost exactly in time. And you'd certainly expect ICU to lag even further. We've always made those assumptions. But actually, it's kind of in lockstep too. So it's very interesting indeed how lockstep these are, these things that should have a delay or lag, right? And you can see how one-to-one correspondence almost. So there's a few reasons for this. We could have a resurgence throughout the population where people in hospitals are now becoming positive, and these two will be linked quite intimately. ICU, though, doesn't really make sense unless people are going straight from home, straight into ICU. But that's not what we're hearing on the grapevine. So there's a real question mark that will have to be addressed in the coming week or two. But the million-dollar question is, with this massive amount of positives, seasonal resurgence, are we seeing big mortality impacts and really severe cases? Or are we seeing a winter resurgence without the sting of mortality that would make it a problematic epidemic? And that's the question. So just to recap, we've got the lockdown mathematically clearly did nothing. And now we've put in lockdowns here again, right, based on this. But hopefully from the rest of the talk I've given just now, you'll know just about what that will offer. which is next to nothing. I'm going to finish off with all-cause mortality. Ireland, 2020, 2019, 18 and 17 are here, and it shows the first 9 months of the year. And the test is, can you pick out 2020? I've jumbled the months. And the answer is, of course, you can't. Here they are. Here's 2020. I just put April in the January slot, but January 2017 and January in 2018 were just as high mortality. So Ireland has no signal for mortality this year in the epidemic year. And here's the full picture. Same thing. April was tough, but no tougher than January in 17 and January in 18. And looking at the overall figures, 2020, not remarkable. And with 2019 having been soft, this should actually be higher in a compensation, but even then it's not. So this is the reality in Ireland. We've ruined our society, caused massive unemployment, misery, suicides, delayed cancer diagnoses, delayed treatments, cardiac deaths at home. The whole sordid mess of lockdown China science has been imposed on us and still is. And no excess mortality in any case, because those things don't really help. So hopefully this update has given you a flavour of Europe, of the USA, a bit of a deep dive in Ireland. England, by the way, and the UK is very analogous to what I showed you for Ireland. So people in the UK, the feedback we're getting is from the hospitals, yes, lots of cases, lots of people filling up here and there, but the mortality way, way lower than the first wave. And the reason is that the first hit, you get community immunity afterwards, the susceptible have passed, and the following winter resurgence, unless you missed the first wave, the following winter resurgence is never going to hit as much in terms of mortality. So UK very analogous to Ireland right now. And that is it. I will be continuing to do updates as the data emerges. Hopefully this one gave you a much, much better overview of all of the kind of scientific aspects and the real impacts in mortality and the real tragedy that in 2020 Europe and the West decided to dump all of our science, all of our pandemic knowledge, all of our knowledge on transmission versus masks and isolation, efficacy, everything dumped to copy China. And just a reminder that I do need support to continue putting together all of this content, and at patreon.com/Ivor Cummins, or for PayPal, please see the description below this video or the pinned comment, and you can do a one-off or a monthly support. So I'd really appreciate that, guys, and keep me getting the science out there and countering perhaps the more biased corporate type science. Thank you.